There are memories that refuse to grow old. Others grow more beautiful every time you remember them. This one belongs to the second kind. When I finished telling you about the unforgettable Sabbath in Bro, my heart wandered somewhere unexpected. Not to another miracle, not to another salmon, not even to another storm upon the sea. It wanders to a wedding. Strange, isn't it? You would expect an old fisherman to remember the day the sea nearly swallowed him, or the day 5,000 people heard from the little boy's lunch, or perhaps the morning death itself surrendered. Yet, whenever my heart longs to remember the gentleness of Jesus, it often returns to Ken. Looking back, perhaps that is because I finally discovered something. I loved ordinary days. He walked into celebrations just as naturally as he walked into suffering. It was as present in laughter as it was in tears. That is the way I came to know him. It was a small village, the sort of place powerful men rarely noticed. No palace, no soldiers, no famous courtiers, just neighbors, friends, families, a bride, a groom, a beginning of a new home. If you had asked me then whether the whole world would one day remember that little village, I would have loved. Yet kingdoms have disappeared, emperors have become names in dusty books, and people still speak about a wedding in Canaan. Never underestimate the places Jesus chooses to visit. By then, our little company had begun to grow. Andrew, of course, had known Jesus before I did. John loved him more than his folk. Sometimes I wondered whether he had the things the rest of us completely missed. Then there was Philip. If excitement could become a man, it would have looked exactly like Philip. He simply couldn't keep good news to himself. Wherever he went, he seemed to arrive with another friend. And Nathaniel? Nathaniel, honest to a fault, the sort of a man who would rather wound you with the truth than comfort you with a lie. I had my doubt about him. Looking back, her little group made no sense at all. Fishermen, dreamers, escaped, different temperaments, different histories, different tasks. Yet Jesus looked at us not as we were, but as we would become. Most people introduce you to your past. Jesus introduces us to our future. The celebration was already alive when we arrived. Music floated through the courtyard. Children darted between the guests. Fresh bread filled the air with its warm fragrance. Neighbors embraced. Old friends laughed. Life felt wonderfully ordinary. Then James suddenly disappeared into the middle of the celebration. Andrew sighed. Oh no. Hey, look, watch. Andrew pointed. Watch. James had found the musicians. Without asking anyone, he began to dance. He was convinced he was magnificent. He wasn't. I leaned towards Andrew. I've seen goats with better reading. Andrew covered his mouth to hide his laughter. John didn't even try. Then I looked at Jesus. He was laughing, not loudly, not careless, just a warm laugh of someone who delighted in people's joy. Sometimes people ask me, did Jesus ever laugh? I always smile. If only they had seen him that day. Holiness does not feel joy. It affects it. As the music continued, my attention drifted, not towards the dancers, towards his mother, Mary. She wasn't watching the celebration. She wasn't listening to the music. She was watching the servants. At the time, I didn't understand why. Years later, I finally did. Truly love others, notice trouble, long before everyone else does. While the guests celebrated, Mary had already seen the embarrassment quietly approaching. The wine was gone. Now, that means very little where you live. But where I come from, that was not all inconvenience. That was shame. The sort of shame families remembered for years. Imagine beginning your marriage with whispers following your name. No bright dreams of that. No groom disaster. Looking back, I often wondered why Jesus chose this moment for his first public healing. Surely there were greater needs. Seek the blind, the poor. Yet he chose to rescue a young girl from humiliation. Back was the day first realized that nothing placed in his hands is too small. Not sickness, not sorrow, not even someone's silent embarrassment. Never believe your body is too ordinary for Christ. He always cared about the things everyone else overlooks. I watched as Mary quietly walked towards him. There was no panic, no dramatic display, only the quiet confidence of a mother who knew exactly where to carry a problem. She stood beside him. Softly she said, "They have no wine." Jesus looked at her with the same love he always carried. "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Mary turned towards the servant. "He didn't hide you, he didn't explain." He smiled and said, "Whatever he tells you, do it." He walked away. That was all. Now looking back, I have heard kings give commands, generals deliver teaches, priests recite long prayers, yet few words have ever carried more wisdom than those 6. Whatever he tells you, do it. If every man, every woman, every nation believed by those words, our world will become almost unrecognizable. At the time, they sounded like simple instructions. Today, I know they were invitations, trusting before understanding him. And once again, I was about to discover that Jesus never revealed all his power. He always revealed his heart. I watched him, not because I expected a miracle. Truthfully, I didn't. By then, I already learned something about him. He rarely answered the question without first revealing something about the one asking it. His mother has spoken only a few words. They have no why. His answer seemed mysterious, yet neither of them have cleared trouble. Looking back, I realized something. Fake does not always understand when it's time in. It simply refuses to still trust in his heart. Then, Jesus looked across the courtyard. His eyes settled upon 6 large stones. I had walked past them without giving them a second thought. Everyone had. They stood quietly against the wall, used every day for ceremonial washing. Nothing about them suggested that generations would one day remember them. Life as starting is something. God delight in beginning extraordinary stories with ordinary things. A ship with staff, 5 smooth stones, a basket holding 5 loaves and 2 fish, and a holed cross upon a lonely hill. And that day, 6 forgotten jars. Never despise ordinary things, even seldom things. He just walked towards them. The servants watched him carefully. Then he spoke, "Fill the jars with water." That was all. No explanation, no promise, no dramatic announcement, only instruction. The servants looked at one another. I could almost hear the questions racing through their minds. Water? For a wedding feast? Surely he meant something else. Yet none of them hugged, none of them delayed. They simply obeyed. Bucket after bucket, they filled every jar until the water reached the very brim. Looking back, I have wondered how many vehicles are waiting on the harder side of simple obedience. If those demands are demanded or statements, they might miss the greatest moment of their lives. Obedience usually walks ahead of the understanding. Around those, the celebration never stopped. Children still laughed, musicians kept playing, friends embraced. The bride smiled without knowing a greatest embarrassment had already been noticed by heaven. That is another mystery of God's ways. While we search for thunder, he often walks in whispers. When the jars were filled, Jesus looked at his servants again. His voice was calm, steady, certain. Now draw some house and take to the matter of the banquet. For the first time, I felt nervous for them. Water? To the master of the feast? If this failed, the servants would bear the blame. One said pastade, only poignant heartlates. Another pointing he placed a reassuring hand upon his shoulder. Without another word, he lifted the cup and walked. Looking back, I realized courage is really loud. Sometimes it's simply carrying a cup when everyone else expects you to fail. The master of the banquet accepted it without suspicion. He lifted the cup, tasted, paused. His eye rose. It tasted again. The music continued. No one noticed except us. James leaned towards me. "What is he doing?" I whispered. "I don't know." Suddenly the master bowed for the bridegroom. His voice carried above the music, gave tone. The musician slowed. Even the servants stopped where they stood. The master looked at the brigadier in astonishment. "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink." He lifted the cleep again, still amazed. "But you have said the best until now." The bridegroom blurted, fused. He smiled coyly, thanked the master. Poor fellow. He had absolutely no idea what had just happened. Sometimes God rescues us. If we haven't been alive, we need rescuing. Only a handful of us knew the truth. His mother knew, the Soviets knew, we knew. Most of the guests simply continued celebrating, laughing, singing, rejoicing, completely unaware that the glory of God had quieted this day their way. He taught me something I had never forgotten. Gilad is not interested in prison crowds. He delights in revealing himself to hearts willing to notice. I found myself looking back at those 6 jars. Water had become wine. The ordinary had become extraordinary. Then a thought entered my heart, not fully formed, just a whisper. What if the greatest miracle Jesus intended was never the wine? What if he had come to transform ordinary people the way we are transformed ordinary water? Years later, I finally understood. Andrew, John, Philip, Nathaniel, James, myself, we were the water. He was always the miracle. Without him, we remain ordinary. Without him, our lives carried a fragrance we could never have produced ourselves. That's why I have never been in praise where people praise Peter. If you've seen the water before the master tossed it, you would have stood. People still speak about the wine. I remember the bright crow. Because before he healed the sea, before he calmed the sea, before he raised the dead, he quietly saved the young cub from the shame. That is the Jesus I came to know. Powerful enough to command creation, gentle enough to care about a family in fear. And that was the day I truly began to understand. Wherever Jesus is welcome, grace always has a final word.